welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. To those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Wolfgang Pusztai. He's an expert on Libya. He's the former attaché to several Mediterranean countries, including Libya, Tunisia, Italy, and Greece. From Austria. He's also a graduate of the National Defense University in the United States, following his studies in Austria. And he is also involved with several organizations that are very much focused on the region and on relations with Libya, and we'll discuss a little bit about that during the program. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm sure our audience would very much like to hear about what brought you to that particular line of work and the region, and some of your experiences. You were on the ground in some of these countries during the Arab Spring. You were evacuating Austrians from there. What was that like? How did you end up there to begin with?
Well, I started to work on Libya from a professional side at about 2004, 2005, during my at that time current job at the Austrian Ministry of Defense. And of course, while I've studied at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. from 2006 to 2007, Libya was also on our focus, because this was just a critical time when Gaddafi decided to give up his nuclear arms program and to open up to the West. Later on, this was very much of value for me, because, as you've mentioned, I was appointed the Austrian Defense Attaché to Libya, starting with the end of 2007, and I fulfilled this function until summer 2012. So this means I had an experience with Libya during the old times of the Gaddafi regime. I've spent a considerable amount of time on the ground in Libya during the revolution, including the evacuation of several hundreds Austrians and other EU citizens, and also later on for some, let's say, intelligence gathering tours. And I've learned to know also the first steps of the new Libya after the revolution. Since early fall 2012, I'm working as a security and policy analyst on Libya outside of my role in the Ministry of Defense. And my main focus with regard to this one is to advise companies who are working in Libya. I'm lecturing and talking and helping for think tanks and on various universities. And I'm also providing advice to various politicians in several European countries and also in the United States. So Libya is really very much the focus of my professional work right now, although I'm also working on other North African countries and on migration, and since about 1 year, a little bit more, also on the conflict in Ukraine, which has a, I would say, quite global impact.
You've had quite a diverse experience, and I think many of our listeners will really want to hear what that experience was like. What was it like to help evacuate people during the Arab Spring? What was the situation on the ground from your perspective?
Well, I was one of the very few embassy officers and intelligence officers who expected the outbreak of the Arab Spring also in Libya. I was in Libya in early January 2011, preparing our embassy and preparing the Austrian companies for an eventual uprising. And I was in Libya again at the beginning of February to prepare the final steps for an eventual evacuation. So I would say it worked pretty well. The situation on the ground was extremely chaotic. And if you would ask me if the intervention, the international intervention in Libya was justified, I would say yes. What I've seen was that the Libyan security forces tried to stop and tried to overcome the demonstrations and the protesters in a very rude, in a very brutal way. Gaddafi promised that he would kill all the reds who are supporting the uprising against him. And if the West would not have stopped him, I'm sure he would have given his best to really kill all the people who were fighting and struggling against him. So it was certainly a necessity to have this international intervention. The intervention went very well. The problem was the aftermath.
So what do you think could have been done to prevent the events that followed?
Well, the key issue thereafter was on two sides. On one side, the Libyans didn't really want to have an international support because they believed that they could control everything on their own. And it didn't look very bad at the beginning because Libya had a vast amount of financial resources, and the first generation of Libyan politicians included several prominent university professors and other experts who were living for decades in the West. So this means the knowledge was there, the money was there. I remember during a meeting with that time acting Prime Minister Ali Dahouni on the side of the Austrian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Ali Dahouni said, "What do you want to advise us with regard to economy? I'm a prominent professor on a American university on the West Coast, so I have the skills. We don't need any kind of international advice." So this looked really great. On the other side, the international community was quite happy that there was allegedly no necessity for another peacekeeping mission or state building mission, especially after the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, after the bloody experiences in these countries. What was overseen was that this first generation of Libyan politicians, those Western educated politicians, had no real support on the ground in Libya. The Libyans said, "You've spent 10 years, 20 years, 30 years abroad, and now you're coming back home telling us what to do." So this first generation of Libyan politicians was gone within months. This was certainly a key problem, that the next generation taking over didn't have a real experience what to do. Another key problem was the spread of militias. After the end of the war, there were about 30,000 freedom fighters under arms, and within, let's say, 6 months, this number increased to about 250,000 people under arms, members of militias. So there was no DDR program. In contrast, the government started to fund the militias on the ground. So this means many young people who had nothing to do decided to join one or the other of the militias to make some money. And if you have plenty of arms in a country, if you have plenty of people willing to join these militias, the outcome is, of course, a nightmare.
I'm going to ask you a question that may not sound very politically correct from the Western perspective, but nevertheless, to me, from based on what you're saying, seems like a very logical question, which is, understandably, Gaddafi was not exactly somebody that anyone wanted to deal with, given his promises of a bloodbath inside the country. On the other hand, you had these professors who thought they didn't need any help. But why was there a gap between this intervention and then this aftermath? Why wasn't there a transition process where Gaddafi was brought to trial or removed, and one of those professors was basically put in power along with sufficient force to transition into some sort of a benevolent transitional government?
Well, Gaddafi was killed on October 20, 2011 in his hometown in Sirte. What would have been required would have been an international state building and peace support mission. This means it would have been necessary to deploy hundreds of experts, Western experts, international experts on the ground. It would have been necessary to deploy thousands of peacekeepers on the ground with the task to disarm the Libyan rebels and freedom fighters and militias, whatever you want to call them. And this did not happen. This means there was no proper security environment there for the establishment of a new Libyan state. And as there was no security environment there, as there was no state control of the weapons, the first fightings in between the former rebel groups started as early as in November. So just 1 month later, after the end of the revolution, the first infighting between the militias started. The problem was there were several root causes. One of the root causes was that the state under Gaddafi was organized in an extremely chaotic way. This means one of the principles of Gaddafi, how to stay in power, was not to allow any kind of opposition in the country. So his principle was to rule the country by chaos. In order to have his own power circle, to have his own people, his inner circle, to control everything. He didn't allow the establishment of a functional administration. So after 2011, there was no foundation of a state where the new Libya would have been able to build on. The next problem was Libya is a very tribal society, especially outside of the larger cities. There are still numerous tribal conflicts which last for several hundred years. Under Gaddafi, these situations were more or less calmed down and suppressed. After the end of the revolution, many of these conflicts, tribal conflicts, broke out again. The next problem was Libya. The state of Libya was only created by the Italians. Actually, Libya consists of three historic regions of the Cyrenaica, or Barca as they call it, in the east, of Tripolitania in the west, and of Fezzan in the south. These three regions developed very differently over thousands of years. While the east was focused towards Egypt and towards Greece, towards the ancient Greece, the west was always focused towards Rome and towards Tunis. The south, of course, down towards Africa. So we had more or less three different entities separated, what I call, by a sea of sands. And these three different entities were merged together by the Italians, and later on, after the brief Libyan monarchy, by Gaddafi. And the differences between these three historic regions are always and are still present. A key problem is that the oil revenues, which are the oil is mainly produced in the south and in the east, but the oil revenues mainly end up in the northwest, in Tripolitania. So many people in the east and in the south say, we are producing the oil, we have the oil, and you are taking the money. So all this is producing several grievances between the different Libyan provinces. All this made it impossible to create a new state. Then in summer 2012, there were the first elections. And this was celebrated by the West, that we had new elections, and there was a huge amount, very large participation. But actually, the problem was only, just let me check my figures. Just about 1.8 million out of about 6 million went to the elections. 1.8 million out of 6 million. About 62% of the 2.9 million registered voters, 62% of those who were registered to vote, but actually only about 44% of the population which was in the voting age. This outcome was celebrated, as I said, in the West, but it obviously showed that the interest in democratic developments in Libya was quite limited. At the next elections in 2014, only about 15%, 15% participated in the elections. So the outcome was that these interim parliaments, at first the General National Congress and then the House of Representatives, had a very limited democratic legitimation. Democracy was never ever an issue in Libya. One could ask, why should it be an issue after the revolution if the foundations are not there?
It seems that the West keeps repeating the same mistakes with tribal sectarian societies, which is not building foundation or trying to build any sort of foundation for a unified state when they can, and once chaos ensues, essentially dropping it. On the one hand, there's this desire to prevent massacres and to see some sort of a civil society involvement in the state affairs, but on the other hand, clearly societies without historical exposure to democratic norms and liberal values are not necessarily going to have those foundations to apply it. And there's also the concerns about expenditures of state building and the level of involvement, and whether the local populations even want that extensive involvement. And we also see the failures from Afghanistan when there's a corrupted process, when the funding is not allocated evenly, and when these tribal issues are not also being addressed, and when there's no experience or mechanism for addressing tribal norms of governance. So is there an answer or lesson emerging from all these experiences that will align international law and international civil norms expectations with the practical reality of societies that are vastly different from European Euronormative, I would say, kind of, and I consider US and many other countries that are not in Europe very much part of the same nation state model. Is there any lesson about the process that can emerge that would address these seemingly contradictory and paradoxical expectations?
Well, I would say the key lesson is that it would have been necessary before such a kind of intervention to study thoroughly the situation on the ground and to better understand the mechanisms and the power groups, those who are really influential on the ground before an intervention. So to better understand the environment, including the security environment, of course, including the history of the country. And if there is a decision, if one is about to decide to intervene, it should have been made clear from the very beginning to those you are supporting that after the successful end of the intervention, there will be an international mission to help the country to get on its feet. So any kind of humanitarian or the international intervention should be in the future, in this kind of the Libyan intervention, should be on the condition that an international state building mission would be accepted. Without the assurance that the group that you are supporting will accept such a state building mission, I think an intervention like in Libya should not be repeated. Without, obviously, if there is no foundation on the ground there, without international help, it doesn't work. That's the key problem. And the international community needs to be clear about this from the very beginning. They need to be honest to themselves. They need to be honest to themselves and to need to be honest also to the people in these respective countries. Otherwise, a scenario of Libya would be repeated. But without keeping the current global circumstances in mind, that such a humanitarian intervention like in Libya would be or will be repeated anytime soon. I think keeping the current geostrategic developments over the relationship between the East and the West in mind, it is extremely unlikely that such an intervention like it took place in Libya 2011 could be repeated.
So since then, we have seen developments that have married this sectarianism, this balkanization of the country with assorted foreign interests that have flown into the country that range from the Wagner militias that are supposed to be providing security support in the east to Turkey and its alliance with West and European countries that have had long-standing interests, and then new players coming in from the outside as well. There's been talks of Iran selling weapons and using weapons, and non-state actors, ISIS and so forth. So how do we, given this complex environment, given the natural resources involved, given the more global state interests, how is it even possible to operate in an environment and to deal with this kind of failed state or non-state situation as if it's still as if it's still a one singular entity? How can, for instance, the United States or the United Nations or any other actor deal, for instance, with the Tripoli government and talk about unity and elections when there are large parts of the populations that don't recognize it at all?
But, well, at first, please let me stress, many Libyans are great in blaming the international community for all the problems they have on the ground. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is true that the international community should have helped Libya also after 2011. But the Libyans didn't want to have such an international support. Mm-hmm. So it's not honest to blame the international community for leaving Libya alone after 2011, while knowing and while keeping in mind that the Libyans themselves didn't have any interest. I remember during this time, I could frequently hear on the roads of Libya, we will be richer than Dubai. They said we have enough money and we will make everything ourselves. We don't need any kind of international support. And also today, it's still the same that many people in Libya are blaming their current situation on the international intervention. But the way out of the current politically dead-end road can only be found in Libya itself, can only be found in Libya itself. Please remember, on December 24, 2021, there was a plan for the United Nations to have elections in Libya. And the whole international community, led by the United Nations and by the United States, pushed for these elections. They used the whole influence they had to make these elections on December 24, 2021 happen. And they did not take place because the Libyans themselves were not able to agree on the proper foundation for the elections. They were not able to agree on who is allowed to run for the elections. So my point is that the influence of the international community on the developments in Libya is limited. There is one exception, Turkey. Turkey has a very strong influence on the developments in Western Libya. Turkey was the country which helped the government in Tripoli in 2019, 2020. Actually, they intervened in January 2020. They helped the Libyan government against Khalifa Haftar, against the command of the Libyan National Army in the east. And the government in Tripoli is dependent on the support from Turkey. So Turkey, yes, they have an influence. They have an influence. But with regard to many of the other countries, I would just say Egypt has also a limited influence on the east. But the United States, the Italians, the French, all the other Europeans, their influence on the actors in Libya is very, very limited. International conferences like these two Berlin conferences, where the top politicians and top diplomats of the West and of also some Arab countries are coming together and negotiating and discussing about what to do in Libya, they lead to nothing until the Libyans themselves agree on what to do. And with regard to Turkey, I remember during the Berlin conferences, it was decided not to deliver any weapons to Libya. Of course, Turkey continued to deliver weapons, as other countries, as the United Arab Emirates. So they said, we will not support our sides, we will not support our proxies in Libya, but they continued to do so. Again, without the exception of Turkey and to some extent Egypt and maybe a little bit the United Arab Emirates, the influence of the international community is limited. The troubles the Libyans they have at home, they can solve them themselves. They just need to have the will. And it's not an easy exercise. Right now, this is about how to establish the foundation for elections. Again, how to establish the foundation for elections. They are discussing since months about the constitutional foundation. And the key problems are, who is allowed to run? Are former military or acting military, like the commander of the Libyan National Army, Khalifa Haftar, allowed to run? Are dual citizens like Haftar and also Prime Minister Dabeba allowed to run? Are people like Prime Minister Dabeba, who promised before the so-called Libya Political Dialogue Forum, which brought him in charge as a prime minister in 2 years ago, he promised not to run for presidency during the elections. He announced in fall 2021 that he would run. This was one of the reasons why the elections did not take place. So the need to decide, is Dabeba allowed to run? The need to decide, is Saif al-Islam allowed to run? And those who are negotiating right now, the two rival parliaments, the House of Representatives located in the east and the High Council of State located in Tripoli, they don't have the power to decide about this. Even if the House of Representatives in the east would say, yes, we agree, military men are not allowed to run, Khalifa Haftar would not accept this. If the High Council of State would say, yes, dual citizens and Prime Minister Dabeba is not allowed to run, Dabeba would simply not accept this. So it is not up to those who are negotiating, it is not up to those who are pushed by the international community to make these decisions. They would need to be honest to discuss with those people who are really in charge, who are really in power, including Khalifa Haftar, including Prime Minister Dabeba, about the foundation for the elections. They're just telling, we need international support, we need to do this and that. And they are not honest enough to tackle the root causes, the real problems, why they are not able to agree on elections. So,
Well,
yeah.
just from what I see, many, if not most of these actors are not actively involved in the international context of negotiation. They're not present at these conferences and meetings, only a small number of them, if any. How do you explain the fact that are they not being invited to have a seat at the table? How is it that there is this separate process of internal decision making for what it's worth, even unsuccessfully, and external Western-led election management?
Well, this was the case in 2014, 2015 during the so-called Skhirat process, which led to the Libya political agreement signed in Skhirat in December 2015, that the people who were negotiating about those agreements were not really those who were in charge on the ground. Namely, the Libyan National Army was not present, and namely, the powerful leaders of the militias in the greater Tripoli area in Misrata were not present there. The outcome was the chaos and the civil war, as we know. With the Berlin conferences, yes, Khalifa Haftar and at that time Prime Minister of the government of national accord did not have their chair on the table, but they were represented. Nevertheless, the outcome was not any kind of agreement about the way ahead. The next stage, the next important element was the so-called Libya Political Dialogue Forum that I've mentioned briefly before, an initiative of the at that time acting UN Special Representative Stephanie Williams. She brought together altogether 75 representatives of the Libyans, hand-picked representatives. So she allocated a specific number to the House of Representatives, to the High Council of State, and to others. And in part, she handpicked those who were participating there. And this group of 75 had the task to designate a prime minister and the presidential council. And after some bribing, Abdul Hamid Dabeiba was selected as prime minister, and the presidential council was also selected. And Dabeiba and the Presidential Council were confirmed by the House of Representatives. And the plan was to have elections later on this year, as mentioned before, on December 24, 2021. But then these very people who were negotiating there had not the power to force Dabeiba and to force Haftar to stick with the rules and to organize elections. So Dabeiba, who promised before his selection as a prime minister, he will not run, as I said before, announced in, I think it was in October, he will run for the elections. And he had a very good chance to win it because he was in charge of the money. He was able to spend the money. So he was actually campaigning, I would say, at the latest since May 2021. While on the other side in the east, Khalifa Haftar, who was, of course, not a member of this Libya Political Dialogue Forum, was in charge of the security environment in the east. He would have been probably able to influence also the elections into his direction. And at the very end, just a couple of days before the elections were called off because there was no agreement who would be allowed to candidate. And if you cannot agree who is allowed to candidate, you cannot have elections. So, as I said, it would be really key to decide on a foundation for the elections, who is allowed to run, and without an agreement on this, you can have numerous Berlin conferences and there won't be an outcome.
So the path to reconciliation, it seems, or any sort of format, seems really fraught with obstacles, and some of those obstacles are in the current leaderships of the various factions. Do you think that one of the obstacles is the fact that some of them are under sanctions or investigations internationally?
Well, reconciliation. We had a ceasefire after the civil war on October 23, 2020. So we are right now just less than 3 years after the end of the civil war. If you have a look into other conflict areas on the Western Balkans, in Africa, in Asia, it is simply not realistic. It is not realistic to have a real reconciliation just a few years after the armed conflict. And the situation is still extremely tense because the root conflicts that I've described before, especially the uneven distribution of the oil revenues, is still a big issue. Corruption is a big issue. The people in the east and in the south say, in Tripoli, they are spending our money and the corrupt politicians are filling their pockets. this is not entirely wrong. So I don't see a real reconciliation coming in the near future. So if you ask me what could be a way out, I would say the only realistic way for Libya to stabilize is to reach back to the Federalist Constitution from 1951. The Constitution from 1951 established a federalist state of Libya consisting of the three historic provinces, Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and Fezzan. And these three provinces had most of the powers, most of the key tasks within the state of Libya. And I don't think it is realistic to stabilize Libya as a centralized state. I think in 10 years, we will either have Libya broken up, or we will, after a bloody civil war, or we will have a federalist state. The question is how to get there.
One of the key issues in any potential power sharing is, of course, the issue of oil, which is quite desirable by all parties. The eastern groups seem to be more in control of them. Turkey has pushed for its own advantage to that extent. There are concerns about Turkey's use of these resources outside in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's all sorts of problems. And how do we address these challenges? How can this format be secured from interventionism and from foreign actors pushing their own advantage and disrupting any sort of potential balance?
Well, we need to have a look on this respective strategic national interests. Of course, major nations, of course, the neighbor states have strategic interests with regard to Libya. And it is necessary to have a more detailed look on this to better understand what they are doing. It is, of course, not possible for the neighboring countries to leave Libya alone and to wait for the outcome, whatever will be. A good example is, from my point of view, Egypt. Egypt has, with regard to Libya, vital security interests. Vital security interests. This is because the eastern part of Libya was a safe haven for various terrorist organizations, undermining the very foundation of Egypt. There was an ongoing insurgency in the Nile Delta. There is still an ongoing insurgency in the Sinai. There was an insurgency in the Western Desert. And then those insurgencies were supported by terrorist groups, by terrorists who had the staging areas, who had the logistic bases in the eastern part of Libya. So for Egypt, it is a vital interest to have the east of Libya under control of a non-Islamist, let's say, leader. For them, it is decisive that the east of Libya does not become again a stronghold of Islamists. If you ask, does this mean an intervention? Is it justified that the Egyptians interfere in Libya? I would say it is about their own security. Is it justified that from Libya, a neighboring state is to be destabilized? So, of course, there are neighbors who have certain security interests, who have certain economic interests and value interests with regard to Libya. And is it right? I would say it is at least understandable. For the Egyptians, it's simply not acceptable that terrorist groups are harbored in the neighboring country. And that's the reason why they were supporting the Libyan National Army under Commander Khalifa Haftar, fighting these Islamists. They were not so much supporting Khalifa Haftar when it was about his offensive to take Tripoli, because their focus is the east of Libya. Their focus is to keep the east of Libya away from the grip of Islamist terrorist organization and Islamist groups. They are extremely worried about the Muslim Brotherhood getting a stronghold in eastern Libya and using eastern Libya as a base to destabilize Egypt. Understandable security interests, economic interests. Libya is an important place for migrant workers from Egypt, not only from Egypt, but in particular also from Egypt. So this means the Egyptians have also economic interests with regard to Libya. Major Egyptian enterprises are working in the construction business in Libya. Egypt is procuring rather cheap oil from Libya. So there are many economic interests. So Egypt has some specific strategic interests which make it logical that they are concerned about the developments in eastern Libya. Let's have a look on Turkey. Turkey, with its ground-down economy and with its long historic relationship with Libya, has of course also particular interests with regards to Libya. This is not so much about security because Libya is not a neighboring country and doesn't have a direct influence on the security situation in Turkey. But this is about vital economic interests. Vital economic interests. Libya was, during Gaddafi, an important site for investments of Turkish enterprises, of major Turkish companies. Turkey is eager to get cheap oil and cheap gas for Libya, for the economy. The Turkish economy desperately needs this oil and gas, this cheap oil and gas from Libya. Turkey wants to use Libya as a hub for strategic expansion into the Sahel region of Africa. So Turkey has vital economic interests. The Turkish economy needs Libya to get on its feet again. Understandable economic interests. Unfortunately, this clashes somehow with the Egyptians, because one of the tools for the Turkish President Erdogan is the support of political Islam, including the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya, which brings him directly into confrontation, of course, with the Egyptians. As it is well known, Istanbul is also the hub for the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. So as long as President Erdogan supports the Muslim Brotherhood, supports political Islam also in Libya, there will not be an agreement with Egypt about how to continue, how to settle the open questions. And one must also understand why Erdogan is dealing into this way. For Erdogan, the more conservative population in the rural areas of Turkey are one of the foundations of his power. So he needs the Islamic leaning, he needs the political Islamists in Turkey as his power basis. Therefore, he of course supports them, and he supports also their let's say, interventions in other countries. So it's always necessary to look into the strategic interests of the countries. Just to compare two European countries, Italy and France. Italy has vital security interests with regard to migration. Italy has a lot of troubles with illegal immigration from North Africa via Libya. This means they need to contain this. Italy has a vital economic interests with regard to Libya regarding gas. Just a couple of days ago, they've signed again a major deal, an $8 billion deal with the government in Libya about the exploitation of gas resources, of new gas fields off the coast of Tripoli and off the western coast of Libya. Gas, as you know, after it's difficult to procure it, or not possible anymore to procure it from Russia, is a vital resource for Europe and of course also for Italy. So they need these energy resources from Libya. This means, as their interests are more or less focused on the northwestern part of Libya, they need to deal with the government in Tripoli. Of course, if you want to make a contract with the Libyan National Oil Corporation, which has its seat in Tripoli, if you want to negotiate with the Libyans about containing illegal migration, you need to discuss with those who are in charge in Western Libya. And this is the government residing in Tripoli. And this means that the Italians, since 2011, were always in touch and in good connections with those government which was in charge in Tripoli. Even in the period from summer 2014 to late 2015, when there was an Islamist government led by, for quite some time, by a prime minister who was a former fighter of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in Afghanistan, the Italians still had some contacts with him because they needed to have these contacts. On the other side, if we look on France, France has vital economic interests in the Sahel region. This is of key interest for the French nuclear power industry, which provides most of the energy France needs. They need the resources of the Sahel for their industry. This means for the French, it's of vital interest to keep the Sahel stable. The southwestern part of Libya is a hub of terrorist organizations, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb, destabilizing this region. Therefore, they need a partner in Libya to fight terrorism in southwestern Libya and to contain the terrorist organizations there. The only one military group with, let's say, some influence down in the southwest is the Libyan National Army of Khalifa Haftar. Therefore, they are cooperating with him. So the strategic interests always drive who is your partner in the country. This determines that the Egyptians are dealing with whoever is in charge in the east, as long as he is not an Islamist. This decides that Turkey is dealing with the government in Tripoli because of the economic interests. This means that Italy needs to deal with the government in Tripoli, and this means that the French need also to deal with those power group who is able to influence the situation in the southwest in Fezzan.
So you've touched on a number of interesting issues, starting first and foremost with security. Given the link between jihadist violent groups and Muslim Brotherhood ideology that is being promoted thanks to Erdogan's interests for what they're worth, it doesn't seem like that can be completely, the security aspects of the situation can be completely fixed and terrorism could be eradicated without also dealing with the ideological context that feeds into that, and that includes both the sectarian divides, the militias that make it easy for groups to migrate and for these individuals to migrate from one group to another. It means the ideological interference from Turkey. It also means local base of support, and so on and so forth. So who and how can really be handling this issue and be a guarantor of that security? Okay, Haftar is one actor, one local actor, but he is not in charge of all of Libya. He's in charge of providing security, especially to Egyptians in part of it, whereas another part of it is, a mix, to put it mildly. How is that situation ever going to be resolved if there is no single leader that can deal with all parts of the country? Can outside and to add to all of that is the lack of success, but most Western countries across Africa in general, in terms of counterterrorism operations.
Well, you've mentioned before the Islamists. The situation of the Islamists in Libya is a very particular one. Libya became a hub of the Muslim Brotherhood during the late 60s after they were evicted from Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood were the first ones opposing the regime of Muammar al-Gaddafi. He suppressed them, as we know, and jailed them in the infamous Abu Slim prison in Tripoli, in the southern part of Tripoli. Later on, there was a return of fighters, Libyan fighters from Afghanistan, the infamous Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which had also some ties to Al-Qaeda. And they tried to overthrow Gaddafi by force in the late 1990s. Gaddafi suppressed them and jailed them in Abu Slim prison, as he did with many other of the opposition. And the opposition against Gaddafi came mostly from Salafi preachers, from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and from the Muslim Brotherhood. So while Salafists are not necessarily the best friends of the Muslim Brotherhood, and there are rivalries between the various Islamist groups, they were all together in this Abu Slim prison. They were suffering together, they were tortured together, and this formed a bond between the various Islamist groups in Libya. And this means that even today, at least the senior leader of the various branches of the Islamists, they have some kind of mutual understanding between them. They remember their common time in this infamous prison. They remember their common suffering, and they have a common vision. Yes, they differ about the way how to get there to establish an Islamist state in Libya, but at least they have a common vision, the common understanding among most of the groups. And this means after 2012, they were able to establish in the western part of Libya something like a deep state. In the security apparatus, in the political apparatus of many parties, in the High Council of State, in the economy, in the key economic institutions, the Islamists and especially the Muslim Brotherhood was able to post their guys into key positions. The influence of the Islamists, I would say, was reduced a little bit over the years, and it's now not as it was in the years 2013, 2014, but they are still there as an important network. And this needs to be taken into account. And it needs to be understood why they are cooperating. It needs to be understood that they have still a common vision. And coming back to the East, as the Islamist assassination campaign in the years 2013 and 2014 was the main trigger for the Operation Dignity, of Khalifa Haftar, it's also clear why the Libyan National Army is on odds and why they are arch enemies with these Islamists. And all this brings me to that reconciliation is not really realistic. So how could things develop from right now? I think the likeliness that the High Council of State and the House of Representatives find to a common agreement, which is really accepted by the people in the background, by Haftar, Dabeba, Saif al-Islam, and the others, is very, very limited. So it's necessary, and the UN Special Representative Abdoulaye Badiyi has understood this, to find some kind of alternative solutions to provide the foundation for elections. The chairman of the Presidential Council, Mohamed Al-Menfi, has recently proposed that he could declare a state of emergency, disband the government in Tripoli and also the rival government in the east, the government of national unity of Prime Minister Dabeba and the government of national stability of Fathi Bashagha in the east, and that he could suspend both rival parliaments and designate a new mini-government with the only task to prepare elections, and that the Presidential Council could establish constitutional rules for the elections by decree. And they could also make a decree about the electoral laws. Sounds great. The question is, would this be legitimate? And the second, maybe even more important question is, would those who are really in charge in Libya, the LNA, the Dabeba clan, the militias in Tripoli, would they accept this? I have some doubts. The militias, especially in the greater capital region, are the kingmakers. Each and every government residing in Tripoli since 2012 was dependent on the goodwill of the major militias there. Each and every government residing in Tripoli was dependent on funds from the Central Bank of Libya, who were providing them the money for their budgets from the oil revenues. And if the governor of the Central Bank of Libya does not fund the government, and if the militias in Tripoli don't let them in, there is no government in Tripoli. Fathi Bashagha, the guy who was designated prime minister by the House of Representatives after the elections in December 2001 did not take place, had exactly this problem. He was selected and confirmed by the House of Representatives as a new prime minister of Libya, but the militias did not let him into Tripoli. And the Central Bank of Libya refused to finance his government. So if Al-Menfi makes a decree, if he decides about the new mini-government and they are not able to rule, what is the outcome? Another option would be, as that time UN Special Representative Ghassan Salameh proposed in 2019 in spring, to have something like a national assembly. To have a national assembly, it was not clear at this time who could be a member, part of this National Assembly, but it would need to include the tribes, it would need to include the representatives from the parliaments, from the two rival parliaments, and I think it would be also necessary to include the legitimated local elected politicians, because in most of the municipalities of Libya, we have mayors and we have local governments who were elected by the people. Yes, in some municipalities elected only by about 10% of the people, in others by 50% and more, but nevertheless, those are legitimated local representatives. And such a national assembly could maybe include these local representatives, could include representatives from the powerful tribes, and this is the still powerful society in Libya, and from the two rival parliaments, and decide about the way into the future of Libya. I think it would be extremely challenging to find any kind of compromise that would be accepted in the East, in the West, and in the South. So I believe that the returning to the 1951 Constitution, to have elections in the East, to have elections in the South, to have elections in the West, and to have a presidential council like we have it in Bosnia from the 3 different provinces. And if in the East they want to elect someone like Khalifa Haftar, they shall do it. If they want to elect someone in the West like Dabeba, they shall do it. And those would be, together with a representative from the Sun, the Presidential Council. Nevertheless, the main powers should rest with the local, with the regional provinces. A key issue is that this 1951 constitution would need to be amended with a formula for the distribution of the oil revenues. The oil revenues, as I've mentioned at the beginning, are mainly coming from the south and from the east. There is the oil crescent to the south east of Sirte, which is where probably about 40% of Libya's hydrocarbon reserves are located. And this is located at the border between Tripolitania and the Cyrenaica. So depending on where you draw the borderline, either a part would be in the east, a part would be in the west, or the whole Sirte basin would be part of the east. If you ask someone from the east, where is the border, they will tell you it's in Sirte or to the west of Sirte, and the whole Sirte basin belongs to us. If you ask someone from the west, they will tell you the border is just to the west of Al-Shabir, a city in the eastern part of the Gulf of Sidra, and half of the oil belongs to us. There are two possibilities. One is that they sort it out by force, that they fight about where the border is, or the second, and then they can deal with the resources from their own respective areas, or the second option would be to find an agreement about the distribution of the oil revenue, so that it would be in the interest of everyone to produce as much oil as possible, because everyone in the east, in the west, and in the south would have his share. So everyone would suffer from an oil blockade, and everyone would benefit if there is more oil produced in the Sirte basin, regardless if this oil well now belongs to the east or to the west. But as long as there is no such formula about the distribution of the oil revenues, as long as they are just discussing about one president in the centralized state of Libya, it won't work.
Well, there are numerous challenges, to be sure. One of them is that from Western perspective, different forms of opposition are of equal legitimacy, and people should decide what they want. But from the point of view of some of the actors on the ground, not all ideologies have equal legitimacy, and some of them are ideologically unacceptable, mortal enemies, and especially if those ideologies tend to be of the proselytizing variety, there is a conflict of interest that is not reconcilable without any sort of combat and one side finally prevailing. There is a zero-sum game approach to these ideological battles, which is why so many people were opposed to the Western intervention with Gaddafi to begin with, not because they love him so much, but because they felt that the West was treating Islamist groups as if they were legitimate opposition, whereas from the perspective of these local actors, they were not, and it was a mistake to give them any sort of legitimacy. I don't know whether that idea can ever penetrate the Western approach to dealing with local issues, but it is a legitimate obstacle to resolving the situation, as I see it.
Yeah, you have perfectly hit the right point. The question of legitimacy is the key question, or is a key question in Libya. Let's start with the easiest question, Saif al-Islam. Saif al-Islam, the son of Muammar al-Gaddafi, is indicted for war crimes, and there is a warrant for him for the International Court of Justice. So this means, from an international point of view, he's a war criminal and he's not allowed to run for presidency. In Libya, especially in the Fezzan, many of the tribes who were always loyal to Gaddafi for some good reasons, because he favored them, he supported them, like the Tuareg, they want to see him again in charge. They want to see him again as a politician leading Libya. How to explain them that there is someone at the International Court of Justice who wants to jail him, and this is the reason why they can't have him as their president. Nevertheless, from a practical point of view, I believe if Saif al-Islam would be allowed to run, he would not be able to campaign in northern Libya, let alone in the cities of Tripoli or Misrata, where there was the most bloody fighting during the revolution in 2011. If he would be allowed to run, I could very well imagine that he would make it in the second round. But then this would break up Libya, because the Misrata, who suffered heavily under him, and I know many terrible stories about what happened during the revolution in Misrata on the hands of the Gaddafi troops, would never ever allow him a comeback. So this would certainly lead to a breakup, to a new war. If Saif al-Islam is allowed to run, this would lead the country into a new war, no doubt about it. It's more difficult who is legitimate among the others, which is the legitimate parliament. Is it the House of Representatives, which was elected already in 2014, as I said, by merely 15% of the Libyans, and the elections of which were ruled unconstitutional by the Libyan Supreme Court in October 2014. Ruled unconstitutional under the pressure of Islamist militias, but nevertheless ruled unconstitutional. So is this parliament, which is still part of the Libyan political structure and which was enshrined by the Libya political agreement, by the Shkira agreement in 2015, is this a legitimate parliament? One could say yes, because it was elected and it is in the Shkira agreement. One could say no, because it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The rival parliament, the High Council of State, is the successor of Libya's first parliament, the General National Congress, which was replaced by the House of Representatives, which was reinstated by the Supreme Court rule in October 2014, and which was established as an advisory body by the Shkira agreement. So is this a legitimate government? One could say yes, because of the ruling of the Supreme Court and because of the Shkira agreement. One could say no. Okay, it depends on the point of view. It's the same with the two rival prime ministers. Prime Minister Dabeba was selected by the Libya Political Dialogue Forum. He was confirmed by the House of Representatives. So one could say, yes, he is the prime minister. One could also say that the House of Representatives has withdrawn confidence from him in September 2021. And one could also say that the term of the prime minister elected by the Libya Political Dialogue Forum was, as it was stated in the document of this Libya Political Dialogue Forum, is only the prime minister for 1 year. So one could say his term is already over, and the House of Representatives was right to select a new prime minister, Fatih Bashaga. So one could say Dabeba is the prime minister because he was elected by the LPDF. One could say Fatih Bashaga is the prime minister because he was elected by the House of Representatives and the term of Dabeba is over. Who is the legitimate prime minister? Which one is the legitimate parliament? That's the difficult challenge. And I don't see any kind of compromise on this. The only way forward is, as I said before, to find a way to get back to the former constitution and to have some kind of federalist system.
And that brings us to the economic side of the issue, which is that Libya attempting to coordinate with the Mediterranean states. And there's an attempt at EZ zones, in parts blocking Turkey's influence. What is the story with this? How successful is this idea, and how would it work in the future?
Well, the exclusive economic zones question is a very important question with an impact not only for Libya, but with a regional impact in the whole Mediterranean. One could say also outside of the Mediterranean. All this started at the end of 2019 when Turkey and Libya, that time government of national accord in Tripoli, signed an agreement about a memorandum of understanding about the delineation of the economic exclusive zones, just in the mid between Turkey and Libya, ignoring that there are some Greek islands in between. Greece and Libya, in Libya, the government of national accord argued that islands don't have an economic exclusive zone, in contrast to the international law of the sea. So if one goes with the international law of the sea, and yes, I know there are some exceptions in there, one could also argue that smaller islands don't have an EEZ. If one goes with the international law of the sea, Greece, the border between Greece and sea border between Greece and Libya would be just in the middle line between Crete and the Cyrenaica. If one goes with the Turkish point of view, the middle line between Turkey is the border between the EEZs, and middle line between Turkey and Libya is the borderline of the EEZs between those countries, and Greece doesn't have an EEZ south of the Peloponnesus. Who is right? I would say in this case, it's rather clear because there is this international law of the sea, and the Turkish position is certainly not in line with this one. This is used by Turkey, or could be used by Turkey as an argument also for the delineation of the economic exclusive zones with regard to Cyprus. They also argue that Cyprus doesn't have an EEZ because it's an island, and they use the agreement with Libya as a precedent. This was became an increasing problem at the beginning of October last year, when there was another MOU between Libya and Turkey about the exploitation of hydrocarbon resources by Turkey within the Libyan EEZ, which could eventually bring them in the future in direct confrontation about this with Greece. We will see. So the EEZ is a very important question with an impact not only on Libya, Greece, and Turkey, but if it's used as a precedent, also for Malta. Malta, according to this, also doesn't have an EEZ, and Malta just recently gave some concessions for drillings to a Western oil company in an area which is also claimed by Libya. If we follow further on the argumentation of Turkey and Libya, Sicily is an island and also wouldn't have an EEZ. Well, you could go through the islands towards to the west to the Strait of Gibraltar, and I think this explains clearly why this would bring a lot of crises and difficulties for the international community if the Turkish point of view that islands don't have an EEZ would be applied and accepted by the international community. The European Union has already rejected these memorandums of understandings, but we will see how things will develop. Greece has tasked a Norwegian company in cooperation with a major American oil company, with Exxon, to start drilling south of Crete in an area which is claimed by Libya as their EEZ. I don't think that the Libyans will try to mess with Exxon, but we will see what Turkey is about to do drillings in what they call the Libyan EEZ north of the Cyrenaica. Economy is a big issue, of course, in Libya, and it's not only about the oil revenues, which are, of course, the backbone of the Libyan economy, but this is also about the waste of money by the Libyan governments, ever since, including Gaddafi, and by the unequal spending of this money. This is, as we've discussed before about the oil revenues, a huge problem. If you have a look on the various cities in Fezzan and compare them with the standards of development in Misrata, that's totally different. And as long as the people in the south, the region where a huge amount of the oil is coming from, don't see that the revenues from their oil end up, at least in part, also in their cities, they will not accept that this will continue in the future. They insist, understandably, that they are also getting their money. Corruption is a major problem. Libya is probably one of the most corrupt countries on the globe. Smuggling is a problem. Smuggling is facilitated also by the huge amount of subsidies that the Libyan government is paying, not only for oil, but also for basic foodstuffs. There are militias in Western Libya and also in the south who are selling the oil they are getting from the refineries, namely from Zawiya to the west of Tripoli, either for free because they simply take it, or at a very low price, at the subsidized price that is usual in Libya, and transport it to the neighboring countries and sell it there. Most of the terrorist organizations who are conducting desert warfare in the Sahel region are getting their fuel from Libya, smuggled from Libya. So this is also a huge problem for Libya, but not only for Libya, because this smuggling is also ruining, of course, the markets in the neighboring countries. Altogether, this must be brought under control if one wants to stabilize Libya. So it's not only about the militias, it's not only about distribution of the oil revenues, it's also about corruption and smuggling.
Can any outside actors, a coalition of actors, for instance, Egypt or other neighboring North African countries, have an impact on the situation? And can there be civil society initiatives to battle to build up any opposition to corrupt practices? Can there be anything done to prevent smuggling through any security local alliances locally? Is there any measures? Are there any measures that can be developed in response to this?
Well, of course, with regard to smuggling, you always have two sides of the border. You are smuggling the oil out of Libya into Tunisia, but you're also smuggling it into Tunisia. So you can guard the border on the Libyan side, but you can also control it on the Tunisian side. So border security is not only a Libyan issue. And while I understand that there is no real border in the desert area of Libya in the south, there is a border over most parts between Libya and Tunisia. So border control is certainly an issue where the neighboring countries could help. Civil society. You have also addressed an important point. I've mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that there is no real structure, there was no real structure, no real structured administration, no real civil society in Libya. A civil society could be an important element in Libya to stabilize the country. A better developed civilian society could be something, an element checking those in charge, those in power, could be something to check corruption. So yes, it would certainly make sense for the neighboring countries, especially for the Arab countries who are able to talk with the people easily, to contribute to the establishment of a vibrant civil society throughout the country. This would be certainly an element that could contribute to the stabilization of Libya.
That brings us to some of the more current events, which is the recent visit to Libya by the director of the US CIA. What can you tell us about this visit and the impact on the security situation in the region, and what is US and others are hoping to get from it, if anything?
Well, as far as I understand, the main purpose and the main topics for the CIA director's visits to Tripoli and to recent visits to Benghazi first and then to Tripoli was about Russia's involvement in Libya and about the terrorist threat. The oil blockades, which were widely discussed in the media, and some kind of pressure on Khalifa Haftar to cooperate with Prime Minister Dabeba, as far as I understand, those were not really the hot topics on the agenda of the CIA director. This was first and foremost about Russian involvement, which means on the deployment of Wagner mercenaries in the east and the role for the Libyan National Army, and on the intention of Tripoli to allow the opening of a Russian embassy in Tripoli. This is what the CIA director discussed with Khalifa Haftar and Prime Minister Dabeba. The more complicated issue is certainly the deployment of Wagner mercenaries. Wagner provides the backbone of the Air Force of the Libyan National Army in the east, and they are also providing experts for the air defense, and they are providing training, and they are providing some reserve forces. The purpose of these Wagner mercenaries in eastern Libya is to balance the presence of Turkish forces in the west of Libya. So if the Wagner mercenaries would be withdrawn from Libya without a withdrawal at the same time of the Turkish troops in the west, the fragile balance of power in Libya would be violated. And this means it might happen that the militias and the troops of the so-called Libyan army, in contrast to the Libyan National Army, in the West, could try to exploit the situation and try to take over, let's say, the whole oil crescent. So it is easy to discuss or to demand that the Wagner mercenaries need to withdraw from Libya. But on the other side, it's necessary to keep in mind that they are part of the fragile balance of power in Libya. The second topic was, as far as I understand, terrorism threat. The United States are very much worried about the situation in the Sahel region. They are very much worried about the French, let's say, hesitation to remain as engaged as before in the Sahel region. And they are very much aware that the southwest of Libya is a hub, is a logistic base, is a safe haven for these various terrorist organizations. And also for the United States, the only one partner they can deal with counterterrorism in the southwest of Libya is the Libyan National Army. This is certainly also an issue which needs to be kept in mind.
In light of the fact that Wagner, on the other hand, is indispensable to LNA's security and defense strategy, but on the other hand, they are a troublesome ally and they're not known for altruism anywhere in Africa. Is there any potential to substitute their presence with some sort of an international force, American mercenaries? Anybody could be less problematic for all parties involved.
You're perfectly right. The sooner, the better that the Wagner mercenaries are leaving Libya. No doubt, absolutely no doubt about it. The problem is that right now there is no real supervision of the ceasefire in Libya. The ceasefire line runs from the west of Sirte, north-south, from the Mediterranean down to the desert, and there is no real supervision. There is not even the planned civilian UN observer mission has been established there. So this UN civilian observer mission was planned, was mentioned in the ceasefire agreement in October 21. Now they are still not on the ground for various reasons. Also because the two belligerent parties don't really want to see them there. So as long as there is no real supervision, let alone enforcement of the ceasefire, I think it is unrealistic to get rid of Wagner. I think it would be necessary to work on the ceasefire, let's say at least observation, to allow the LNA to get rid of Wagner. As long as the ceasefire is not guaranteed, as long as they are scared that the militias in the West and the Libyan army in the West could exploit the withdrawal of Wagner, they will not agree to this. The role of Wagner is first and foremost to act as some kind of tripwire. The Egyptian President Al-Sisi has declared in summer 2020, a red line to the west of Sirte. He said, if the Turkish forces, if the militias, if the forces from Western Libya would cross this red line, the Egyptian military would intervene by force in Libya.
But short of this dramatic scenario, is there no way to attract foreign forces that could play the same role as Wagner is playing now without the downsides of their, of who they are?
The role of Wagner would be to buy some time for the Egyptians to intervene.
But there's no one else could play the same role, no foreign force or international mercenary groups that are more acceptable.
I don't think that any Western state would be ready, or any Arab state would be ready to deploy a force under control of the Libyan National Army. Wagner is more or less under control of the Libyan National Army in Libya. I think the real way forward would be to establish some kind like a ceasefire observer force or something like this.
Well, all of that complicates also the issue of humanitarian aid and basic economics on the ground, and I think I'd be curious to see how that is being handled, and how is any humanitarian aid distributed under such conditions, and what is the current state of the economic development?
Well, Libya is in theory a rich country because of its oil wealth. A huge amount of assets, of Libyan assets, are still frozen on the international banks, including the about $70 billion of the Libyan Investment Authority. And this still makes sense, because if the current government, if any of the interim governments would have access to this money, it could be wasted in a minute. And therefore, it makes sense to keep this money frozen until there is a legitimate elected Libyan government, and then they shall do with their money whatever they want. So Libya is in theory a rich country. They do not need a lot of investment. They do not need a lot of financial aid from the outside. In theory, they would have the possibility to do it on their own. But yes, there is a huge demand for humanitarian assistance, especially in the south and also in more remote areas in the east. The challenge for the international humanitarian organizations is the security on the ground. Most of the organizations who work in the south of Libya work with locals because of the security risks. So these areas where this international humanitarian assistance is needed would be needed to be stabilized. How to stabilize Fezzan? By, I would say, help of the international community by creating an infrastructure, by creating jobs, by establishing schools, by establishing health facilities, by giving the people in the south a perspective to live without the need of Sahara trade or smuggling or human trafficking, as we would call it, without the need to work for a militia in order to earn some money. So the whole region in the south needs to build up from the scratch. And this is challenging, keeping the security environment in mind.
Do you think that in light of that, US and some of the other oil companies that left due to business and security risks during and after the Civil War might make a comeback, or do you think this will not happen until there is some sort of a agreement on the ground?
Well, several of the international major oil companies are still there. They are working mostly with locals, and they are demanded, they need to invest also in the local communities. So part of each investment of any international oil company is to invest also into the infrastructure of the local communities and so on. But this is far from being sufficient. The major investments from Eni, we've just mentioned before, the $8 billion US dollar investment into Libya's oil and gas industry, is about offshore. Is about offshore, which is of course much more safe than to work further down in the Sahara region. So security is also a precondition for further developing the hydrocarbon sector. The chairman of the National Oil Corporation, Farhad bin Gadara, said recently that they want to develop, expand the oil production from about 1.2 million barrels per day to about 2 million barrels per day. I've discussed with some oil experts about this, and they said it is maybe realistic to expand to 1.4, 5, or 6 just by drilling new additional oil wells, as it is already planned, or as it was already planned for years. But to expand significantly above 1.5 million, it would be necessary to maintain the whole Libyan oil infrastructure. The pipelines are rusty. The infrastructure in the oil fields needs to be maintained. The terminals on the coast need to be maintained. And all this would not only need money and investment also from the West, it would also need Western foreign expertise. And this is difficult to get into Libya as long as the security situation is as it is right now.
Well, that leaves a very complicated scenario, which is, better than a civil war at its peak, but at the same time still has a lot of security and regional and global repercussions beyond its own borders that are very concerning. In light of that, my question is about the National Council on US-Libya relations. What role do you think such an organization can play, and can they safely host events in Libya that could include some sort of a discussion or mediation or some sort of a broader engagements beyond events being hosted in the US?
Sorry, the connection was interrupted during the first part of your question. Could you repeat, please, the first part?
My question was about the National Council on US-Libya relations. What role can they play, and whether it's possible to host something in Libya and to have a broader engagement from Libyans themselves?
The main purpose of the National Council of US-Libya relations, where I am the chairman of the advisory board, is to improve the understanding and to improve the cooperation. That's a two-way road. So on one side, we are facilitating American support to Libya, including some medical missions. Our founding president and chairman of the board, Dr. Hani Shenib, leads personally medical missions in Libya. He is a cardiovascular expert, and he is one of the most world-famous surgeons. He is leading medical missions throughout Libya, and he is helping people on the ground. We have established medical aid programs, also remote programs via internet to help the people on the ground. And what we are also doing is to provide information to the people, to the politicians and decision makers in the United States. What we are doing is also to explain the Libyans how to get better in touch with the United States. So we are trying to facilitate the connections and the cooperation between both sides. Yes, we are also discussing with Libyans about potential ways out, but we are not biased into any way. So the National Council in US-Libya relations is neither supporting one side or the other in Libya. We're just working on a better understanding.
So it does not have though a mediation or any sort of a diplomatic role beyond you just promoting relations with the US. It does not have any sort of a...
No, we are not conducting any direct mediation in Libya. That's not the case. What we do is we have on mid-February a conference in Washington D.C. where we have as guest speakers some of the key international diplomats working on Libya, including the US Special Envoy Richard Norland, including the French Special Envoy and the German Special Envoy, the chairman of the National Oil Corporation, one of the presidents, Musa Al-Koni. He's a member of the Presidential Council of Libya, and many famous other Libyan speakers. So we aim to discuss solutions. We aim to discuss potential ways forward, but we don't have a direct mediation role.
Interesting. I wonder if in the future holds future civilian initiatives of that sort that could bring various parties together for dialogue and exchange of ideas, but that are also based in Libya itself. We have seen too many of international gatherings in the US and Europe, but that kind of look exclusive to the locals because they don't have an opportunity to host something right on the ground, especially for many people in the US who've never been to Libya.
But through our program, we are also, of course, reaching out to the local entities in Libya, and we are discussing with them, and we try to better understand their intentions, their problems, and we try to help them to voice this out to the international community. But we don't envisage for the time being to host a larger conference in Libya.
Okay, thank you. That was incredibly insightful, and I think many people here who may be confused by the headlines or on the contrary, by the relative lack of information and focus on Libya, given the nature of media crisis hopping from one war to the to the next one, and now focused on Ukraine. Just as before that it was focused on other issues. I think they will really appreciate this perspective and this in-depth understanding of what I see as a very, very important region and a very important security, economic, and diplomatic concern. Thank you
very much for inviting me. Libya is certainly in a geostrategic important region, just in the center of the Mediterranean and bordering many critical areas in the Southern Sahara region. And it is necessary, or let's say it would bring a lot of benefit for the whole region if the country would get really stable again.
I certainly hope so. I think that hopefully we will learn from past experiences as well as from new ideas and new perspectives that hopefully will emerge, and that the future will be better and we can manage these complications. For everyone watching, this was the Washington Outsider report on the Coalition Radio. With you was Irina Zuckerman and Wolfgang Pusztai, our special guest, discussing the situation in Libya and the history, as well as the latest current developments and what they mean and the implications. Thank you for joining us, and please join us again next week, same time, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Thank you again.